If you haven't already, please watch the interview I did earlier today with Professor Christian Luprecht from the Royal Military College about whether or not Canada is engaged in some kind of soft warfare, cyber warfare, a different kind of warfare than we're accustomed to. And then I'm talking about, of course, the occupation of Ottawa and the money that's going in to fund it and the encouragement from actors, political actors outside of Canada. And it's good background for the interview I'm going to do now, which is with Senator Paula Simons from Alberta. And she has unique thoughts, of course, a unique take on the whole issue. So welcome to the interview, Paula.
I'm very happy to be speaking with you again, Markham.
Well, we're happy to have you here. And this is very, very concerning. And the whole point of the professor's argument was that the conflict is a political conflict, as we know it, even military conflict, is different. It's a different world. And Canadians have become very complacent. We haven't been to war in 70 years. And we need to start rethinking about how people are attacking us and attacking our interests. So what's your take on that as a senator?
Let's start with what we do know. What we do know is that this occupation of our nation's capital, together with the very damaging border blockades in Coutts, Alberta, and on the Windsor-Detroit border, is being funded in large part with money that is coming from outside this country. It is coming on platforms, these international platforms that allow people to donate money anonymously. So it's coming in a frictionless way. We don't know where it's coming from. We know that some of it seems to be coming from the United States. And we know that certain right-wing American political commentators and politicians are encouraging American donations to this kind of soft attempt, a bumbling attempt at a coup. But it's one thing to know that the Americans are being very upfront about this. The other question is all the money coming from the United States? Because there are other international players who may be funneling the money through American actors, who may just be donating anonymously, and we have no way of knowing. I've been watching The Americans, the show that's on the Disney Channel about Soviet agents embedded in the United States during the Cold War, and perhaps I've been watching too many episodes of The Americans. But I think in this world in which money can move without trace across borders, it is a legitimate public policy question for Canadians to address. Where is this money coming from?
And I asked Professor Luprecht about, what's the motive of these people? I mean, why bother? We're a G7 country, but we're not that big. And he replied that it's in their best interest to undermine the oldest, arguably the best functioning democracy in the last 150 years, and to play with our economy, to disrupt our economy. It's in their best interest, both domestically and, of course, in geopolitics. Because, for instance, Russia threatening the Ukraine, we're part of NATO. All of that, and in Canada, we were a little insulated and inward looking, I think, and we don't quite get that we're maybe a target these days.
I don't sit on any national security committees. There's good reason for that, discretion not necessarily being my longest suit. So I have to assume that there are security experts in Ottawa at CSIS who are thinking about these things. I hope they are thinking about these things, because these are the questions we need to be asking ourselves. When I was a kid, we worried about bombs. We worried about, nuclear warfare. We worried about people marching over the Arctic Circle. War is not going to look like that in the future. But I think that we don't necessarily have to use militaristic rhetoric to be concerned about what's happening here. And it's not just a question of money. It's a question of manipulation on social media. I've been tracking some very interesting investigative work being done in the United States. I'm going to be speaking to some of the people who've been doing that work next week, who are looking at the way social media platforms such as Facebook are amplifying and manipulating information. I'm from Alberta. I know perfectly well that lots of the people who are on the ground in Coutts and in Ottawa are authentic Canadians. I don't want to say they have legitimate grievances, because I don't believe that they have legitimate grievances, but they have authentic grievances, and they are authentic, real life Canadians who've driven there. But it's interesting, on Facebook, what's happened over the last couple of days, the last week and a half, is that the original Facebook platforms created by angry Canadians have been replaced in large part by Facebook pages that appear to be based in the United States and that appear to have false identities running them. You know, I read some very interesting work done by The Grid that looked at the fact that the woman whose name is listed on these top Facebook pages talking about the events in Ottawa claims, it says that's not her name, that her account was hacked and her identity was stolen. So I think we have to ask ourselves, who is manipulating the flow of information? And at a time when mainstream media, traditional media sources are under siege economically, when people have been encouraged to lose confidence in those mainstream news platforms, people are getting misinformation and disinformation, and they're being fed lies that are coloring their attitude. And as I've listened to people attacking me on Twitter over the last few days, it's been really fascinating, because what you realize is that you're dealing with people who are operating in two separate realities. And it's really hard to negotiate or have any conversation when you're talking past each other, because you're literally not inhabiting the same cultural space.
Right. And now that leads me to another question, because you're a former journalist, longtime columnist at the Edmonton Journal. And one of the features of the Trump movement, I'm going to call it authoritarian, because I think that's fair now. I see a lot of Americans calling it authoritarian. So one of the key features of that is the demonization and delegitimization of the media. And what do I see in this? The exact same thing. And I'm often attacked on, I get direct messages and so on, people swearing at me. And a lot of it starts with, you effing journalists. That's what they go on, attacking credibility. And as a former journalist, what's your take on that?
I saw today a CTV reporter in Edmonton tweeting that they have been advised to take the CTV decals off their vehicles so that people can't identify them. I was at the CTV station in Edmonton yesterday, and I'm not sure I should say this, but because of the convoy, they had put up large locked fences all around the compound, and they have security guards there, and you cannot get close to the station without going through a security cordon. That is unprecedented. I mean, in my time as a journalist, we dealt with lots of angry people. Even long before I came to work at the Journal, they had a gentleman come in and take hostages with a bomb and demanded that, that people print his grievances on the front page. And I think the Journal printed him a fake front page, and then the police took him off. But those were like isolated kooks. We've always had isolated kooks. Now people can come together and share this misinformation and feed on each other's fears and paranoias. I mean, there's a lot of QAnon rhetoric that you see with the people who are in Ottawa. There are these demands that the Prime Minister, resign, the Prime Minister be arrested. Some people have certainly made plain that they would like the Prime Minister to be executed. I mean, and I heard your previous guest saying, well, maybe and I've heard other people saying, well, maybe the Prime Minister should be negotiating with these people. I don't know how that would work. How do you negotiate with somebody whose primary demand is at best that you be forced from the elected office you just won in a fair and square election a few months ago, and at worst, that you be hanged? There's lots of ground to have debate about whether, given the nature of Omicron, we need to have as many vaccination restrictions as we once did. When the vaccines seemed like a surefire solution to the spread of the disease, I think the public policy case to get as many people vaccinated as possible was much clearer for people. And now that we know that Omicron doesn't provide that kind of protection, I can understand, even if I don't agree, I can understand why people are saying, look, what is the point of having all these rules if the vaccines don't even work, if you can still spread the disease, if you can still get the disease, even if it's in a gentler form. You can have a fair-minded, honest debate over whether or not this particular restriction should be in place, whether or not truckers should have to be vaccinated at this point when the horse has already left the barn and Omicron has already spread. That's a public policy debate I'm prepared to have. I'm not prepared to have a debate with somebody who says to me that they believe the Prime Minister is drinking the blood of child sacrifice victims in the fountain at 24 Sussex Drive. I mean, that kind of like literal psychosis is not a basis to have a public policy debate.
Well, and isn't this turning into almost I feel like there's the old saying that whatever happens in the US, 5 years later, you'll see it in Canada.
With poorer production values.
With poor production values. So 2016, 2017, we saw this starting with the Trump presidency. And 5 years later, here we are. And I feel like it's deja vu all over again.
I think what we have to be grateful for, I mean, I'm horrified by what's happening in the streets of Ottawa. For me, as somebody of Jewish descent, when I see people waving swastikas, when I see Confederate flags, I mean, those are triggering for me in like a very literal sense. I mean, it's very hard for me even to look at those symbols of hate and stay calm. But I think at this point we have to be grateful, and I hesitate to say this, touch wood. There's been violence. There hasn't been as much violence as I feared. And perhaps there hasn't been as much violence as the American agents provocateurs expected there to be. In a strange way, everybody in Ottawa is behaving with almost a satirical degree of politeness, right? Not the people who honk their horns for days on end, but the police and so far as I can tell, things have certainly not been great, but they could have been so very much worse. And it gives me almost pause that we're developing a false sense of security, because this is a very small number of people who are holding the capital hostage and who are closing borders. This is a very small number of people. What happens if the next time something like this happens, it's not so small and it's not so disorganized and it's not so bumbling? Suppose next time the arrow is a bit more pointed.
Well, I've thought since the start of this that one of the dangers here is that it spreads across the country. And I know on the first day, so a week ago Saturday, I live on Parksville on Vancouver Island, and sure enough, there was a convoy right through town with big trucks and so on. And how long before a number of these people decide that they can blockade the port at Nanaimo, or the port at Vancouver, or precisely
don't give people a game plan. But honestly, I mean, I'm a bit taken aback, given what's been happening in Alberta, that people at the Detroit-Windsor border seem to have been caught flat-footed. I mean, could this not have been anticipated, given what was already happening in Ottawa and in southern Alberta, that something like this might happen at one of our most important borders? What is kind of fascinating to me is to see small c conservative business interests who are horrified by what's happening, whether those are, the beef industry in Alberta or the auto industry in Windsor, right? I mean, these are actions that are doing extraordinary damage to Canada's economy. I mean, the people on Parliament Hill are getting most of the attention, but in all honesty, I think some of the biggest economic damage is being done at these border crossings. And what I really fear is that not just that we're going to see upsets to our economy, that we're going to see destabilization in Ottawa. We've already seen the destabilization of the Conservative Party as a result of this. But what I really worry about is that we are going to end up with people, I mean, we say in silos, but we've got people, a small percentage of the Canadian population, let it be said, maybe 10, maybe 15%, that's still a lot of people who are existing in an alternative reality with alternative facts. And I don't know how we get them back to the light. I don't know how. I mean, this predates COVID. You're right, it began with Trump. COVID has caused an escalation of everything. But they're a group of Canadians, and they're not all on the right wing. I mean, some of them came from the left and the center left, for whom I think conspiracy theories provide a reassuring answer. It's almost easier, I think, to believe in an evil conspiracy than to just believe in the anarchic power of a mutating virus. I think there's almost some comfort in believing that there's some great actor out there controlling everything. At least then somebody would be in control, instead of this horrible sense that we're out of control.
Paula, always enjoy your insights and our conversation. I'll leave you with this, and that is a certain percentage of 10 or 15%, whatever it is being radicalized. And they're being radicalized along these conspiratorial lines that you're talking about. And it's, again, I get back to this idea that we're complacent, where we think that we're not prepared for a radical faction within our population.
I think we've always thought it couldn't happen here. I think lots of Canadians watched the American politics of the last 5, 6, 7 years and thought, oh, tisk tisk. Thank goodness that would never happen here. And I think it's our besetting sin sometimes as a nation, a certain sense of moral complacency.
I believe it's called smugness.
I was going to say smugness, but I didn't think that was a good look for me. So I don't want to say smugness.
Okay, I can say that other people have accused Canada of that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, human nature is a universal thing. And I think sometimes we forget in the 1930s how close North America came to making common cause with the fascists, how close we came to not standing up to Hitler. It is not an inevitable part of our narrative history that Britain, Canada, and the United States would have stood firm against fascism. There were considerable economic and political forces who believed that Hitler and Mussolini had the right model. And I don't think we should ever allow ourselves to think that we have some kind of innate moral superiority in this country that indemnifies us from the lure of fascism.
Final thought. I talked about being complacent about a radicalized small faction within Canada, but also complacent about threats from without. And that is maybe one of the positive things that might come out of this crisis, is that we take a look at our own complacency. Paula, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Delightful. Thanks, Markham.